Morning sifted through the canopy like warm honey, gilding every fern and bead of dew as the forest of this fringe colony yawned awake around the little homestead at its edge, where Cade Mercer preferred silence to city noise and bird song to the hum of dome ventilation, where vines had crept across the cabin's timbers until the place looked half-grown and half-built, a compromise the woods seemed willing to tolerate, and Cade, too, who had traded his badge as a survey tech for a toolbox, a few solar mats, and a snare line that usually brought back rabbits. Not drama, not voices, not trouble with sharp ears and a tail burning orange like a fallen sunrise. And yet as he stepped into the glade that day, breath fogging in the cool, he heard an irritable growl and then a very articulate complaint about ridiculous human contraptions, and his chest gave a puzzled thump because snare lines didn't talk, until he parted the ferns and saw someone who very much did. She hung upside down from a sprung tension wire, ankle neatly cinched, hair like spilled fire sweeping the moss, triangular ears twitching through the tangles, one enormous tail fluffed to twice its size in outrage, and amber eyes leveled on him with the affront of a queen surprised by a mud puddle. And Cade had the absurd urge to laugh because she hissed at him like a wet cat threatening the weather, and still managed to sound regal, demanding he stop gawking and release her at once. Which he did, because she was tangled but not helpless, furious but not afraid, and because even at a glance he could tell the trap had bruised pride far more than flesh. So he knelt and bled off the tension with practiced fingers, lowering her to the ground where she landed in a grumbling heap, pushing hair from her face with brisk dignity, as if none of this had happened, except for the tail, which gave her away by flicking like a metronome set to indignation. "You leave metal cords in our forest," she accused, shoulders squared, chin high, and Cade echoed the word "our" without thinking, amused by the way ownership grew teeth when spoken from a muzzle that was not quite a muzzle, by a woman who was not quite human, and not quite anything the settlement brochures had ever admitted lived beyond their fences. And he said the snare was for small game, not sentient visitors with a talent for lecturing, and that he hadn't meant to catch anyone capable of loudly critiquing his engineering, and she shot back that humans built first and asked never, and he let the jab land because it wasn't wrong, and because up close the wire had left a faint ring on her ankle, and he hated leaving marks on anything that insisted upon its freedom so convincingly, so he offered a hand and his name, and she took the first but not the second, trying on a wrinkle of a smile as she said, "Neary," like a wind slipping between stones. And he repeated it to memorize the shape, invited her back for coffee, partly because humor was how he sanded off sharp edges, and partly because curiosity weighed more than caution whenever the woods offered him something he didn't understand. And Neary followed with loud skepticism and quiet interest, sniffing at the kettle, prodding the solar regulator, examining the data slab while declaring it had a trapped spirit inside, which made Cade cough-laugh and explain current and circuits and the unromantic hum of capacitors. But she tasted the coffee anyway and recoiled as if he had offered boiled bark, asking why humans loved bitterness that insulted the tongue, and he grinned and said habit could comfort even when it wasn't pleasant, which earned a small bell-like chuckle from a mouth that had hissed so fluently minutes before. And in that mingled sound of kettle steam and reluctant laughter, the quiet life he had curated for years shifted 1 millimeter towards something brighter without his permission. The next morning, there were delicate footprints circling the porch, light as leaf shadows, and Cade looked up from his mug in time to catch a streak of orange vanishing into fern shade, and he called out that stalking required breakfast, and from somewhere behind a log came a quick, indignant, "I am not stalking," which he translated as observing. And after a day of this theatrical not stalking, she stopped pretending, padding into the clearing at dawn with eyes full of questions and a tail that telegraphed moods even when her voice was busy being clever. And she asked what a kettle was and why it whistled, and why the square box hummed like a sleepy hive, and why humans put roofs on things the sky had already covered. And he said roofs kept rain predictable but not always respectful, and that humans built tools because we were soft and impatient. And her ears tipped at that, conceding the point like a queen granting a minor treaty to a peasant who had accidentally been charming. They developed a rhythm before either admitted it, A routine knitted from curiosity and teasing, work and wandering, with Cade checking sensors and splice points while Neri leaned over his shoulder, suspicious of indicator lights and delighted by any device that chirped when she poked it. And in the afternoons, she would crouch by the snare line with a vine looped around her fingers, insisting that she didn't need help, tying knots with fierce concentration that promptly failed physics. And Cade would lean against a trunk and offer lessons he disguised as jokes: loop, tension, anchor. And she'd roll her eyes and copy him perfectly except for the part where she stood in the wrong spot. And when the vine yanked her ankle yet again and lifted her 1/2 meter off the moss, she crossed her arms and declared it a design flaw while glaring upside down at him until he laughed too hard to lecture, the forest ringing with a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. He lowered her gently every time, made a ritual of it even, hands careful at knots, voice softer than his grin, and she pretended to be annoyed but let her tail brush his knee when she landed. A quick flick like punctuation. And in the evenings she would sit by the little stove and call his fried rations noisy while eating most of them, and add berries to everything and call that improvement. And when rain came in silver curtains, she pressed her nose to the window and said the sky was washing the world. And then said he was enchanted when he watched her watching it, and he joked that maybe he was. And the air between them changed shape for a heartbeat before she broke it with a question about the wrench, and he told her it kept things from falling apart. And she hummed, as if filing that away with 1,000 other human mysteries on a shelf she would absolutely reorganize later, at night. The forest swelled with the safe sounds of a world that tolerated them both, and under that hum, Neri told stories about old groves where her kin rarely let human scent drift, about rivers that sang on certain moons, about elders convinced curiosity was a crack in a dam. And Cade listened because he'd grown up inside humming shells of glass and steel and liked the way her voice edged those old images with teeth and tenderness. And once he asked whether she missed them, those who called her too tame, and she twined her fingers through her tail and said sometimes, in a voice that made sometimes feel like a door she could open or close. And he said he was an odd one out in his cities too, and she decided without proof that the forest had arranged their collision. And he didn't argue because the snare incident had already made a case for cosmic slapstick. By the 3rd week, Neri's visits were no longer visits but habits, and Cade woke to her humming as she invented chores he didn't ask for, sweeping the porch with a stiff branch while pretending it was a sacred ritual, ferrying herbs to hang in orderly riots across his rafters, declaring the data slab's glow a captive aurora while he tried not to smile at how easily his space absorbed her. And when he caught her learning the solar generator by nearly shocking herself twice, he taught her properly and pretended not to notice the way her ears tilted with pride afterward. And together they tested lines by the stream again, where she nearly perfected the anchor until the loop volunteered to hug her midsection like a smug vine. And he laughed and said gravity was rude, and she said she hated physics. And then she looked up at him from the moss, with eyes that warmed the rain itself, and murmured that if she hadn't been caught that first day, she wouldn't have found him, and he said he should thank bad design. And she said it was too good. Cade learned her tale's dialect the way settlers learned bird calls, slow and by accident. Lazy sweeps meant content, brisk swishes meant a storm in a teacup, and quick little flicks meant mischief was stretching before a sprint. And he learned that when she wore one of his old shirts on cold mornings, she held herself differently, irony wrapped around comfort, and that when she braided his hair for protection, she laughed at how it tickled, and that when she climbed onto the roof, she loosened more tiles than she repaired, but accepted his scolding like a cat accepts rules, as objects to be batted off the table in slow motion before curling into the warm spot the broken rule revealed. And on a moonlit night when she steadied herself with a hand on his shoulder and didn't move it, the wood under his boots felt like tide, and they both looked away at the same time without stepping back. They shared dinners that looked like diplomacy between worlds, her foraged bright things and his practical browns, and she arranged nuts and berries with an artist's patience, saying food should look happy to be eaten, while he grilled vegetables with a reverence she pretended not to notice. And later they sat under a quilt on the steps and counted satellites gliding like distant fish, and she said humans were loud and curious and careless, and then tapped his chest and edited the sentence smaller, and he admitted he still liked his traps. Not because they made catching easy, but because they turned chaos into a hinge he could understand. And she said traps could hold moments the way they held feet if you built them right. And he blinked at the truth disguised as teasing because he had, without drafting, built a life that now held an amber-eyed intruder shaped suspiciously like joy on a bright morning thick with birds. Nairi announced she would craft a flawless snare and dared him to watch. And he pretended to study his slab while tracking every confident step. And she enumerated anchor, counterweight, line, and declared the arrangement perfect, and then stepped exactly where she shouldn't. Because tradition is a river that loves its channel, and the branch flexed, and the loop congratulated her ankle by lifting it. And Cade leaned on a tree and laughed like he owed the forest interest on all the laughter he'd withheld for years. And she glared at him upside down with cheeks warm enough to light the moss, and demanded rescue in a voice that already contained its own smile. And he obliged, fingers gentle, words teasing, and when she touched the ground she bumped his shoulder with a hand that lingered. Said perhaps she liked being rescued when it was him, and he started to argue and then didn't. Because some arguments asked to be left where they glow by the time twilight stitched purple through the canopy. His cabin had admitted it was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a den with two heartbeats. Hers sometimes curled on the hearth like an ember that purred. Hers sometimes returning to a tiny nest she'd woven of branches and stolen shiny scraps from his junk pile, which she called architectural salvage while he called it adorably illegal. And when rain returned with soft knuckles on the roof, he fixed one of her snares at the table, and she leaned on her elbows and asked whether he had thought her dangerous that first day. And he told the truth, that he hadn't had time to be afraid because she had filled the air with demands and therefore oxygen. And she laughed and then sobered and said, humans often hurt what they don't understand. And he set the pliers down like a promise and said, not today, not here, not you. And the lantern hummed in the hush that followed. Her fingers brushed his wrist, a small contact that rippled wider than logic. And she said he didn't have to keep letting her stay, and he said he wanted to. And her tail ticked against his knee like a heartbeat, trying on a faster tempo. And she murmured that the second time the snare took her, she hadn't been frightened, because he ran toward her sound, and he almost said something foolishly permanent, though he settled for admitting she had trapped his quiet and changed it into something he didn't want to escape. And she smiled the smile that made her look more wild and more gentle at once, and told him he was trapped too then, and he nodded because consent had never felt sweeter. And she leaned forward until her forehead touched his, not a kiss but a map drawn very close, and when she slipped into the soft rain after that, she left warmth braided into every shadow like a scent trail any hunter could follow. At dawn the world smelled rinsed and new. And Cade stepped out with coffee and saw small bare footprints tilting toward the outer glade. So he followed through thread-bright sunbeams and chatter above, and came upon Neri lecturing a coil of rope about how it would behave this time, while her setup impersonated perfection until the moss betrayed a telltale soft patch and the line hugged her waist like an over-eager vine. And she flopped into leaves with a groan about hating physics, while Cade folded in half laughing until she forbade it. And when he knelt to free her, the laughter softened around the edges and she said that if she hadn't been tangled that first day she wouldn't have found him. And he said again that flawed designs had their mercies. And when the last knot slipped free, she didn't rise, just looked up at him as if the forest had gone still to listen, and asked whether she was really free. And he brushed a leaf from her hair and said, freedom was bigger when you chose where to stay, which made her eyes glow like lanterns catching dawn. And she said then she might remain. They walked back side by side, her tail doing that lazy content sweep that had become his favorite weather. And when they reached the porch, Neri announced they were expanding the den because she required shelves for important treasures she absolutely did not hoard. And by sunset a clever little gable had grown from living branch and salvaged planks, and he admitted it looked better than anything he'd planned, and she preened with shameless pride. And later they ate and traded bites and declared the results survivable. And as the stove ticked down, she asked if he thought about futures, And he said sometimes with a smile that accidentally described small, loud versions of her chasing his tools. And she thumped him lightly with her tail and called him ridiculous, and then tucked closer anyway, humming an old tune that sounded like rain finding the right leaves. And he breathed with it, until the forest and the room and his chest felt tuned to one slow, shared tempo days spilled into each other like sunlight over leaves, each one beginning with the same soft rhythm of rustling fur, boiling water, and a voice that had once hissed but now hummed off-key songs while reorganizing Cade's sanity. The forest seemed to lean closer to listen. Birds grew braver near the cabin, and even the wind carried a warmth that hadn't existed before Neri decided she was not merely a guest, but co-owner of his peace. She arrived each morning with something new, a cluster of berries, a shiny pebble, a story, and Cade stopped pretending he didn't wait for her. He told himself it was habit, a comfort of company, but the truth sat heavier, more dangerous, tucked beneath every glance when she smiled over her shoulder, tail swaying like punctuation at the end of an unspoken sentence, one that started with curiosity and threatened to end with affection he wasn't ready to name. They worked side by side through the slow pulse of days, fixing traps, mending nets, and rebuilding the solar panel she had once improved into near detonation. Cade tried teaching her patience, but patience was not a trait woven into her wild fiber. She wanted to touch everything, to test the way the world bent and hummed beneath her fingers. When he explained that electricity traveled through metal faster than sound, she had tilted her head and asked how he knew that without tasting it. He had laughed until his sides hurt, and she had pretended not to be pleased by his amusement. Their laughter, their arguments, their silences, all of it stitched them into the fabric of the forest itself. Two mismatched threads that somehow found harmony. Rain came often that season, soft and steady, and the forest transformed under its silver touch. They would sit inside, shoulders nearly brushing, as water traced rivers down the glass. Nairi would speak of her clan's beliefs, spirits hidden in the oldest trees, voices that whispered to those who listened long enough. Cade found himself wanting to believe her. It was easier than believing that all this, her laughter, her scent of pine and smoke, was merely coincidence. One afternoon, when thunder rolled like distant drums, she looked at him with that half-smile that made logic lose its footing and asked if humans always ran from storms. "Not always," he said. "Some of us build roofs just to sit under them and listen." She nodded thoughtfully, ears twitching at the sound of rain. "Maybe you're part fox after all," he grinned. "Only if it gets me a tail like yours." Her laughter answered him before she could. When the skies cleared, the air grew thick with new life, vines stretching overnight, blossoms opening like lanterns. Nairi insisted they explore deeper into the forest, farther than Cade had gone since settling. She moved ahead with the confidence of someone who belonged, stepping lightly between roots, pointing out hidden wonders, mushrooms that glowed faintly in shade, stones warm even without sunlight, a stream that sang in two tones at once. Cade followed, stumbling on roots she seemed to glide over, and though she teased him mercilessly, there was pride in her voice when she said, "You're learning to see." It took him a moment to realize what she meant. She wasn't talking about the forest. She meant her world, the one of scents, sounds, instincts he had never noticed before she taught him to slow down long enough to listen. Their return that evening was quieter, both of them carrying the calm weight of shared discovery. Neri lit the fire while Cade cooked, and when she curled beside the flames, tail wrapping his legs, he didn't move her away. "You humans build walls because you're afraid of being seen," she murmured, eyes half-lidded. "Maybe," he admitted. "And you hide in forests because you're afraid of being found." Her tail flicked once. "Maybe." Between them, the fire cracked softly, burning the space where fear might have lived. He watched her reflection shimmer in the glass window and thought that if loneliness had a cure, it might look like this, half light, half laughter. Wholly unexpected, a few mornings later, he woke to find the porch swept, tools sorted, and Neri perched on the railing like a sentinel, staring into dawn. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Didn't need to," she said. The stars told stories all night. He chuckled. Anything good? She turned toward him, expression unreadable. They said everything ends. He stopped mid-sip of coffee. That's a bleak prophecy for breakfast. It's truth, she said simply, tail curling tighter around her ankles. But it doesn't mean bad. Some endings make room for better things. Her tone was soft, almost tender, and Cade realized she was looking not at the horizon, but at him. He looked away first, pretending to watch the mist burn off the trees, his heart knocking awkwardly at his ribs. Life settled into something that wasn't quite domestic and not quite wild. Nairi built a garden of sorts beside the cabin, half herbs, half weeds she swore had magical properties, and Cade built her a small water filter so she could stop drinking straight from the stream. She called it over-engineering. He called it hygiene. They argued. They laughed. They compromised by ignoring each other's advice until proven wrong. The cabin filled with their contradictions, his neat rows of tools, her chaotic pile of shiny trinkets. His bland rations, her explosions of color and spice. His quiet nights, her endless stories. And through all of it, something unspoken grew, delicate as moss creeping over stone. One night, under a sky pricked with cold stars, Nairi asked if humans mated for life. The question hung in the air longer than the smoke from their fire. Cade hesitated. Some do, he said finally. Some don't, depends on what they find. She studied him, eyes catching starlight. And you? Have you found something? He looked at her, really looked, at the way the fire painted her skin in gold, at the ears that twitched even in stillness, at the tail wrapped around her like a living question. I'm still looking, he said. She smiled, a small, secret curve of lips that didn't reach her eyes. Then maybe you shouldn't look too far. He wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already standing, stretching, tail swaying lazily as she disappeared into the night. After that, something subtle shifted. She stayed closer, her teasing softer, her silences longer. When she brushed against him, it was no longer accidental. When she laughed, it sounded like she was trying to chase away the weight between them. And Cade, who had once been fluent in solitude, now found words clumsy and silence heavy. One evening, when he returned from checking traps, he found her sitting by the door, holding a broken vine loop. I ruined your trap, she said quietly. Guess I'll have to teach you again, he replied, kneeling beside her. Or maybe, she said, voice barely above a whisper, you'll let it stay broken. He looked up, confused, and she met his gaze with a softness that stole his breath. Not everything needs fixing, Cade. Then she smiled and handed him the loop, walking away before he could answer. Spring arrived in earnest, spilling color over everything. The forest pulsed with life, birds nested in his rafters, and Nairi claimed half the porch for herself, calling it her thinking spot. Cade didn't argue. He had long since surrendered the illusion of control. They spent afternoons building, cooking, talking. Once she tried to weave vines into the roof, declaring she could help nature help him. The result leaked in 7 places. He said nothing, just repaired it the next morning. She pretended not to notice but brought him berries afterward, her version of an apology. In the evenings they watched the horizon turn molten, and he'd catch her staring at the light like she was memorizing it, as though she feared it might vanish. One morning, she found him sitting by the stream, staring at his reflection. You look haunted, she said, settling beside him. Just thinking, he replied. Dangerous hobby? He smiled faintly. I was wondering what happens when someone who wanted to be alone stops being alone. Nairi dipped her fingers in the water, sending ripples through both their reflections. Maybe they realized they were never alone, she said. Just waiting. He turned to her, startled by the simplicity of it, by how easily she spoke the thing he hadn't been able to name. Waiting for what? She shrugged, tail brushing his side. For someone stubborn enough to stay. That night, thunder rolled again, closer this time. The storm rattled the windows and they huddled near the fire, warmth wrapped around laughter and electricity both. Nairi leaned into him, tail coiling over his knees, her voice a murmur beneath the rain. If I vanished, would you look for me? Cade's breath hitched. Don't vanish. She smiled sadly. I didn't ask what you want. I asked what you do. He met her gaze, steady and sure. I'd follow your footprints until the forest gave you back. For a heartbeat, she didn't speak. Then she pressed her forehead to his, a quiet promise forming in the space between their pulses. Then I won't make you chase me. When dawn came, the storm had gone, leaving the world washed clean. Kate stepped outside and found a single paw print pressed into the wet earth beside the door, deep and deliberate. He smiled, heart light, because for once he didn't have to wonder if she'd return. He already knew. Inside, the cabin smelled of her herbs and laughter, and when the sun broke through the trees, it painted everything in gold and orange, just like her. The weeks after the storm blurred into an easy kind of rhythm, the kind that happens when two lives begin to orbit each other without realizing it. Cade no longer woke to silence. He woke to the sound of paws padding across wooden floors, the clatter of mismatched mugs, and Neri talking to herself as she rearranged his world for the 1000th time. The cabin that had once been a refuge for solitude was now alive with motion. Herbs hanging from the rafters, flowers tucked into corners, the scent of wet fur and forest woven into every breath. He pretended to grumble about it, but when she wasn't there, even for an hour, the place felt too still, too clean, too much like the life he thought he'd wanted. Neri was chaos and calm, wrapped together. She'd hum strange melodies as she worked, sometimes in languages he didn't know, soft and haunting, songs that seemed older than the colony itself. When he asked about them, she'd shrug and say, "Old fox songs. They keep the forest listening." He never knew if she was joking or confessing something real, but he liked to believe the trees bent a little closer when she sang. On good days, she dragged him outside to help her improve the garden, which usually meant turning his vegetable patch into a maze of glowing fungus and wildflowers. When he teased her about planting more magic than food, she'd flick her tail and say, "Beauty feeds the spirit. You humans are always starving it." Sometimes, when the afternoon light hit just right, he'd catch her standing at the edge of the clearing, eyes half closed, face tilted toward the breeze. She looked more like something the world had imagined than born, an echo of warmth and wildness. And every time he saw her like that, the thought whispered uninvited, "Don't let her vanish." Their conversations grew quieter but deeper. He told her stories of the domed cities, towers of light, endless noise, people who forgot what stars looked like. She listened, fascinated and horrified all at once. "You built cages for the sky," she said once, tail curling tight around her. "Why?" Cade had no answer, just a sigh. "Because we thought safety was the same as happiness." Neri looked at him then, eyes soft but unyielding. "And now?" "Now," he said slowly, "I think safety's overrated." The forest changed with them, vines creeping higher, blossoms blooming faster, the clearing becoming something between a home and a secret world. Their days were full of small, perfect moments. Her teaching him how to tell the difference between a sleeping tree and a dead one, him showing her constellations through his battered telescope. At night, when the fire burned low, she'd curl beside him, tail draped over both their legs, and whisper questions about everything he took for granted. Why do humans dream? Why do you write names on things? Why do you look at the stars and call them home when they never answer? He tried to answer honestly, but more often than not, his words faltered. Sometimes she'd laugh softly and say, "That's why I like you. You don't pretend to know everything." One evening he found her sitting on the roof again, legs swinging over the edge, fur tips glowing in the last light. "You're going to fall one of these days," he called. She smiled down at him. "Maybe, but you'll catch me." "That's not the point," he said, but his grin betrayed him. "It is for me," she replied. When summer thickened and the nights turned warm, she started sleeping inside more often. Sometimes she'd take the couch, curled like a flame in a blanket. Other times, when storms rolled in, she'd end up beside him by the fire, tail flicking lazily against his arm. The first time it happened, neither spoke of it. By the fifth, it was simply expected, as natural as breathing. He'd wake with her head tucked beneath his chin, her ears twitching at his heartbeat, and think, so this is what it's like not to be alone. One afternoon he caught her staring at a broken trap wire with a pensive look. "You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Catching me." Cade leaned against the tree beside her, considering. "Only when you're loud before sunrise." She elbowed him, but her smile faltered a little. "No, really." He thought about the quiet years before her, about how they'd stretched endless and colorless. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. I think the forest wanted us to meet." Her eyes shimmered gold in the dappled light. "That's something my people would say." "Then maybe your people were right." She studied him for a moment longer, then said softly, "If I'd never been trapped, I would have kept running. And now?" "Now," she murmured, "I think I've stopped." That night, she cooked for him, a chaotic blend of roots and herbs that looked questionable but smelled incredible. When he took the first bite and survived, she looked absurdly proud. "See? You can trust me with food?" "Barely," he teased, and she smirked, tossing a berry at his head. Later, when they cleaned up, she lingered close, brushing his shoulder now and then like she wasn't sure if she wanted to pull away or stay forever. The next morning, she was gone. Her things, the trinkets, the herbs, the nest of blankets, remained, but she wasn't in the cabin, not by the garden, not by the stream. The air felt wrong, hollow. Cade called her name once, then again, louder, but the forest swallowed his voice. Panic flared sharp and unfamiliar. He followed her usual paths, checking every trapline, every clearing, every place they'd laughed together. Nothing. The silence pressed harder with every step. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dying fire, watching shadows crawl along the walls, telling himself she was fine, that she'd wandered off chasing some curiosity. But the next day came and she still hadn't returned. The forest that had once sung around him now felt like it was holding its breath. On the third morning, as dawn broke pale and cold, he found it, a single tuft of orange fur snagged on a low branch, glittering faintly with dew. Beneath it, footprints, smaller than his, leading toward the deeper wilds, the forbidden zones where even drones didn't map. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pack, his tools, and followed. The forest changed as he walked. The trees grew older, their bark thick with silver veins. The air shimmered faintly, charged with something electric and ancient. He realized belatedly that he was walking into her world now, the one she'd always spoken of with half myth and warning. Every instinct told him to turn back. He kept going. Hours passed. The light dimmed, though the sun still burned overhead. When he finally found her, she was standing in a clearing unlike any he'd seen, trees bent inward like a cathedral, roots glowing with faint luminescence. She turned when she heard him, eyes wide, tail still. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she sighed, a sound equal parts relief and guilt. "You shouldn't have followed. I told you I would." Her ears drooped. "You don't understand what this place is." "Then explain it." She hesitated, then stepped aside, revealing a ring of carved stones half buried in moss, symbols pulsing faintly along their surfaces. "It's home," she whispered. "Or what's left of it." He stepped closer, careful. The air hummed. "You came to say goodbye." Neri looked at him, eyes bright with something between sorrow and peace. "I thought I had to. They called me back. My kin, my kind. I thought—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "I thought staying with you would mean forgetting who I was." "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now I realize leaving means forgetting you." The wind stirred the trees, scattering light like embers. He wanted to reach for her, but didn't, not yet. "You don't have to choose," he said finally. "Not between two homes. Just choose where you want to stand today." She laughed softly, the sound trembling. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he admitted. "But I'll still be here, even if you walk away." Neri stepped forward then, close enough for her tail to brush his arm. "You're a strange human, Cade Mercer," she murmured. "You trap things and still set them free." He smiled, voice low. "Maybe I finally learned how to do it right." The forest around them exhaled, the stones dimming, as though whatever ancient call had pulled her had eased its grip. Neri took his hand. Then maybe I'll stay a little longer. They walked back together, the path softer now, the weight between them changed, lighter, stronger. The forest didn't resist their footsteps. It seemed to welcome them. When they reached the cabin, the air smelled of rain again. She stood on the porch, looking at the home they'd built, her eyes reflecting the light like twin suns. "You were right," she said. "Safety's overrated." He chuckled, stepping beside her. "Told you." She smiled, and for the first time since she'd vanished, he breathed easily again. "Then let's be reckless." The rain began as a whisper, then grew, drumming gently on the roof. She leaned into him, tail curling around his waist, and together they watched the storm. The world outside was wild and alive, but inside, the air hummed with something steadier, a quiet kind of forever, wrapped in the warmth of two souls that had stopped running. The days that followed her return felt softer, as if the forest itself had drawn a long breath and decided to rest. Rain came and went in silver threads, washing the moss bright again, and Cade found that every sound, the creak of branches, the hush of wind, now carried something familiar, almost domestic. Nairi had stopped wandering at dawn. Instead, she'd sit cross-legged by the fire, braiding vines into impossible knots while lecturing him about proper forest etiquette. He pretended to listen, half because her seriousness amused him and half because watching her talk was its own kind of peace. When the weather cleared, she set about expanding their world again. Together they patched the leaky roof, replaced the broken trap lines, and built a small covered deck that she immediately claimed as her sun place. She spent mornings sprawled there, tail glimmering in the light, pretending to nap but keeping one ear angled toward him. Cade discovered that when she was content, she hummed low under her breath, a sound that made the air itself vibrate. He caught himself timing his heartbeat to it, the way sailors timed to waves, steady and sure. Their routines blended until neither remembered whose idea they'd been. He'd check the solar cells while she gathered herbs. She'd fix dinner while he carved small tools for her experiments. She was endlessly inventive, stringing wires through vines to make chimes that played when the wind shifted, crafting lanterns from hollowed fruit that glowed with foxfire when dusk fell. At night, they sat on the steps together, wrapped in one blanket, speaking in half-sentences that said more than whole conversations ever could. One evening, the sky turned the color of molten gold. Nairi balanced on the porch rail, eyes on the horizon. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "After this?" Cade considered. "I used to. Now I don't want to plan too far ahead." "Why not?" "Because for the first time I like where I am." She smiled without turning. "That's dangerously close to happiness, human." "I'm aware," he said, grinning. "It's terrifying," she laughed, hopping down beside him, her tail brushing his arm. "In my clan," she said, "we believe joy is a wild thing. If you try to trap it, it escapes. You can only walk beside it." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll walk beside it, as long as it stays." "It will," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. Seasons shifted. The forest swelled with life, birds nesting in their rafters, fox kits, smaller, wilder cousins of Neri, darting at the edges of the clearing. Cade began keeping notes on their behavior, half as research, half as excuse to watch her delight when they tumbled through the grass. She'd crouch low, tail flicking, calling them in with sounds too high for his ears, and they'd creep forward, curious but unafraid. "They trust you," he said once. "They know their own," she replied simply. One late summer night, heat thick in the air, Cade woke to find her sitting by the window, moonlight tracing silver down her hair. "Can't sleep?" he murmured. "Too quiet," she said. "You're snoring," he chuckled, pulling himself upright. "That quiet, huh?" She turned to him then, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. "When I first met you," she said, "I thought humans were just noise. But you're a silence that doesn't hurt." The words settled between them like a heartbeat. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "And you're the chaos that finally makes sense." For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the trees. Then she leaned forward, closing the space between them with a kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like an answer they'd both been circling for months. It was gentle, brief, and absolute. When they pulled apart, she laughed quietly, breath trembling. "You're trapped now, human." "Gladly," he said. From then on, the forest seemed to approve of their union. The storms milder, the nights warmer, the mornings bright with birdsong. They built a small pond behind the cabin, planted flowers that bloomed in patterns only she could predict. She began teaching him her people's ways, how to read the language of wind, how to hear the difference between rain that nourishes and rain that warns. In return, he taught her to write, her sharp nails carving letters into bark and scrap metal alike. She practiced endlessly, scrawling his name into the dirt until she could spell it without looking. "Now you can't forget me," she teased. "As if I could," he answered. Sometimes visitors from the colony would pass nearby, surveyors or traders mapping resource lines, but Cade always sent them away quickly, claiming malfunctioning terrain. The forest was theirs, and he wanted to keep it that way, untouched, unrecorded, a secret stitched from laughter and moss. Nairi agreed. "Let them have their cages," she said. "We have the sky." Autumn crept in quietly, painting everything in amber. The air smelled of pine smoke and ripening fruit. Cade began to notice small changes. Nairi growing sleepier, her tail fluffing thicker, her appetite doubling. She insisted it was seasonal, her body preparing for colder months. But one evening, while sorting herbs, she paused and pressed his hand against her belly. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. He did, a faint flutter like a heartbeat too small to name. He looked up at her, eyes wide. She smiled, serene and certain. "The forest gives back what we give it," she said. Winter arrived early that year. Snow draped the trees in silence, and their cabin became a pocket of warmth in a world gone white. Nairi moved slower now, her steps measured, her laughter softer but no less radiant. Cade did everything, cooking, tending fire, fixing leaks, while she rested near the hearth, humming lullabies that even the wind seemed to pause for. When the first cries came one blue dawn, the forest stirred. Birds rustled from branches, deer halted mid-step, as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. Hours later, Cade emerged from the cabin, exhausted and grinning, cradling a small bundle wrapped in woven cloth. Tiny ears peeked out, fur-tipped. Perfect. Nairi followed behind him, eyes shining brighter than any sunrise. "He has your stubbornness," she said. "And your tail," Cade replied. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless joy. The child grew quickly, toddling through the grass, half wild, half wonder. Sometimes Cade would find Nairi teaching him how to listen to trees. Other times she'd hand the boy a wrench and declare, "Your father's tools are sacred artifacts." The forest accepted the new laughter easily, folding it into its own rhythm. Years passed. The colony's noise stayed distant, a rumor beyond the tree line. Cade's hair silvered. Nairi's eyes remained bright. The child grew into the kind of soul the world rarely made, curious, fearless, kind. And whenever he asked how his parents met, Nairi would grin and say, "Your father trapped me." Cade would groan. But the story never changed. "He caught me by accident," she'd continue, "but I decided to stay on purpose, on quiet nights. After their son had fallen asleep and the forest hummed its endless lullaby, Cade and Nairi would sit outside watching the stars. The cabin had aged with them, vines thicker, wood softer, but the light inside still burned steady. Sometimes he'd glance at her, tail coiled around them both, and marvel at how a single misfired snare had rewritten his life. "Still think safety's overrated?" she'd ask. "Completely," he'd answer. "Though I wouldn't call this unsafe," she'd smile, leaning her head against his shoulder. "No, this is what we call found." And when dawn came, spilling gold through the forest, it always caught the two of them sitting there together, a human and a foxwoman, surrounded by the home they'd built, the laughter they'd nurtured, and the quiet proof that sometimes the best traps are the ones that catch your heart and never let go.